I feel Welcome to the show. This is Sunday Spotlight, and we got a wonderful guest today from Line 6, the chief sound engineer from Line 6, Ben Adrian, well known in the Helix community. And without further ado, let's bring him on. And hello, sir. How's it going?
Good evening, Chad. It's going very well, all things considering.
yeah. This it's one of those. It's good. There's so many people doing so many different things online, but it's kind of good to take a break and get down to nerdy and talk about some of the cool things that you do and how long you've been doing them and so let's start off. Let's start off with give us a quick rundown of your experience in music and what how you got to do what you do.
Okay, it's a long circuitous path, but I really I grew up in Indiana and in the suburbs, and there was not much to do, and I was into weirdo music and playing guitar in bands, and I was just kind of one of those people where it's like I didn't want to find stuff. I wanted to make things happen for me. So when it came time for my band to play, we had to book our own shows and find our own PA, and I was always the guy who wanted to run sound. We went into a studio, and it just seemed really cool, and so I next time we just spent the money on getting recording gear instead, and I started recording my own band in like our basements, and then I started recording friends' bands, and next thing I knew, I was kind of like the recording engineer in town for all the kind of punk rock and weirdo bands in Indianapolis. And I started playing around with pedals. I was always into pedals and gear. I just, it came naturally. It's kind of a separate, a separate world from actually making music is the gear world. But I was always kind of broke, and I was always modifying and tweaking around in gear, trying to figure out how things worked. And next thing I knew, I was repairing friends' amps. I was the repairman and the recording engineer, and I kind of had a realization, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, where it was like, oh, the part of me that's creative and make music and the part of me that's into gear isn't necessarily like intertwined anymore. It was kind of weird. Whenever I'm making music, it's like the gear kind of comes second to being creative, but when it comes time to like play with the gear, I'm really into the gear on its own. So, I started building my own pedals, and I worked as a mastering engineer in a recording studio in San Francisco. And I would just, if there was something that seemed really cool, I would just dig into it and try to learn as much as I can. And it led me to Line 6 about 8.5 years ago. And I've been there ever since, making cool guitar gear and trying to do as much fun and crazy stuff as I can.
Well, job well done and great success. And, my favorite amp looks like this. So, a lot of people, there's this thing I think it's in life in general. You have people who are vested in what they've personally chose. It's called confirmation bias. But everything in gear, everything in music is all subjective to the person's personal taste. So let me ask you, when you're designing the Helix amps, when you're porting them in, can you walk us through what you do there? How do you start? I mean, I look at the amp and I go, turn it on. I hope it works, but you look at it in a completely different way.
Kind of. I would say, the modeling procedure when we're modeling, we'll talk about amps. What we model is to try to recreate the circuit that is in the amp in the digital domain. And I try to be agnostic about the whole thing. Like, I'm a neutral party. I'm Switzerland. There are amps that I use and I love, and there are amps that I, particularly don't care for. It's no big deal. Lots of people, lots of tastes. But, when I'm modeling an amp, my own personal taste usually doesn't go into it at all. So, we decide whether Eric is like, oh, we need this amp because no one else has a model of it, or this is what people really seem to want, or if it's just someone's like, hey, I found this really cool sounding amp. First, we find the amp, we make sure it works and it's in a good running condition and everything is pretty cool about it. We either find or draw our own schematic for it because we want to know what's going on. And if you know about electronic circuits, you can kind of look at a schematic and you can kind of tell what is sonically going to happen as you work your way through. And then we're able to use test probes. Let's see. I'm in my home studio, but we've been working from home. We have these. We just use these oscilloscope test probes, like just what you would use to clip on. And we have gear that we've built so we can clip onto the amplifier at various points. And then we send test signals into the amp. And we can measure what changes, like say after the sound of the first tube. And then there's software that the super smart, awesome DSP engineers at Line 6 have written. And in using that software, I can recreate the sonic changes that happen like throughout little bits of the amp. So
I imagine that when you're testing those and this sonic character that you run through it, maybe some sort of sweep, or does it sweep through some sort of sound? I mean, I know enough to break stuff. So
I'm sure you know more than that, but yeah, we do frequency sweeps at various levels. So it's like, here's how it sounds quiet, here's how it sounds louder, and we go into distortion with frequency sweeps because the EQ of, a stage of an amp will change depending on how hard it's being hit.
Right.
We do level sweeps where it's one tone and it's just going up like and then starts to distort, and we can kind of see the point at which it distorts and how the knee is, if like it goes softly into distortion or if it's a very quick transition. And then we also take wave shapes with like an oscilloscope so we can see what the waveform actually looks like when it's distorting. And by matching all of those in the digital domain, obviously with taking into account like what to do and what not to do to avoid digital artifacts and badness, we can recreate the same signal changes. Because if you think about it, like if you send a guitar signal through an amp or a distortion pedal or whatever, you have the guitar signal, and then the signal gets changed by distortions of the amp, the tone shaping of the amp, the way that the power amp happens, the way that the sag happens. There's all these things that just change the sound, and then it comes out the end. And so what we try to do is, rather than make some of our own original amps, but we're trying to just make all the same sonic changes in our models that happen in the real amp, whether or not it was even designed to do that in the first place. Because a lot of the sound of rock guitar and what people know is actually, wasn't really supposed to happen in the classic amplifiers, but it did, and people like it. So
right,
you have to figure out what mistakes are enjoyed.
So when you get through and you've put all this together, you model these independent little pieces so that when you run into that piece in another amp, you know exactly what it does? Or does it somehow, because of the previous thing that's connected to it, does it act differently under certain circumstances? So like, do you test this spot, but then test this all three for its own independent character, right?
Yeah, unfortunately there's nothing we can really take from one amp and just migrate it into another one, because voltages are different and the way power supply behaves are different. So we're kind of looking at each amp as its own unique thing, its own unique item. And even though we still use the same like DSP tube simulator for the preamp tubes in every model, they have wildly different settings on a model to model basis. So it's just like the behind the scenes. It's like, if you're painting, you can use blue and red, but it just depends on how you combine them in a different way, and you get a different picture. So
do you in the electronics certain amps have twisted wires. Does that make a difference in tone?
Yeah, I would say theoretically no, but in practice yes. And where it makes a difference in tone is from accidental interactions. And there's one story that's legendary in Line 6 land from even before I worked there. And it has to do with a Vox AC30. And the guys who were modeling it were playing through it, and there was it sounded just weird, like a little dark. They're like, well, I don't understand why this amp doesn't sound right. It used to sound right, or something, I forget, but it just didn't sound right. And they opened it up, and they realized that I think whomever had put it back in the chassis last time had hit a component, and the component had bent. And it didn't actually touch anything, but it had gotten close to another part of the circuit. And there was enough of an electromagnetic field coming off the other one that it kind of created an unintentional interaction and rolled off a bunch of high frequency. So, those kind of internal layouts can actually decide the sound of the amp in ways that the designer might not even know. And there's a lot of times people build clones of an amp in a totally different building construction method, and it doesn't sound exactly the right way. It sounds pretty close, and might sound good or even better to someone's ears, but the direction and order in which it's put together and the construction type does affect the sound. But I wouldn't hesitate to say any way is better or worse than another. It's just all a little bit different.
Well, yeah, I agree with you on that. It's just a matter of differences. And so one manufacturer like Marshall or Fender, they can have a line of amps that they just run off the line, and there can be even differences from amp to amp.
Oh yeah.
So why wouldn't there be slight differences? To me, for what I've been with modeling, everybody's like, well, it needs to sound like this amp. It doesn't sound like that amp. And I remember being in the, I was totally blown away. You were working on the SLO model in your area, and you switch back and forth between the model and the real thing. And I'll tell you, I couldn't tell the difference. It was pretty incredible. So, people are always obsessed with, I need to make it sound like this amp or that amp. I really like to sound like what I like it to sound like. And Helix, if you just twist the knob here or the knob there, you can get about anything you ever intended or wanted. You want it. So so tell me, what's the most dangerous situation you've been in Line 6 without violating any?
I think NAM is probably because people want to talk to me and they're all sick. But no, I don't know. There hasn't. There's a few things. I'll mention a couple different ones that are in totally different things. We have the Beasts, which is the Yamaha 36x10 cabinet that was at NAMM the other year. And there was a guy who does film scoring who wanted to come in and get samples of that cabinet in the office. And so I was called in on the weekend to kind of help put this together and make sure everything went okay. And everyone was wearing massive hearing protection, and I had my decibel meter out, and I think it was 128 decibels 10 feet away from the amp. And I'm wearing earplugs, and then the gun, the earmuffs over it. And then after 5 minutes, I would just go into another room. I just would not work. So that was probably pretty dangerous. But we were very cautious, and we really took care to make sure that no one was in really any serious danger.
Talk about the brown note.
Yeah, they were trying to find it. No luck that day. The other one is, I'm sticking my hands in live amps, and, Line 6 and Yamaha is very cautious about that. If I'm ever doing anything dangerous, I'll get really dangerous. I'll get one of my coworkers, and I make sure we deal with a lot of old amps that were never grounded properly. So, we actually have like grounding rigs, so we can ground them properly when we're modeling them to make sure that they, we can't hurt ourselves. But there's been once or twice where the ground clip has come off, and then I've touched something that otherwise would have been safe, but there's maybe a little bit of wall current in it because of that. And that was a couple close calls. Nothing that really zapped me majorly, but they're, we get to go slowly. We get to go at a reasonable pace. No one's breathing down my neck, pressuring me. So I can really, stay away from dangerous. I think sound volume is, like I said, like the first story, is probably more dangerous than the electricity.
Well, it was just told to raise up my mic.
Okay.
So hopefully I didn't blow your ears out. Yeah. Well, one time I was playing guitar, and it was at a friend of mine's house, and it was a tube amplifier, and it was in a garage, and I don't know that there was really good ground in the garage. That it had rained. There was a bit of water on the ground, and I felt a shock in my hand when I was playing guitar, and I was like, I think I'm done. So well,
there was that happened to me. I was borrowing a friend's amp. It was an old Silvertone from the 60s, like the popular Silvertone amps. We have one model in Helix, but it was two-prong, and it was the kind where you could actually turn the cord 180 degrees. And then there was a steel beam in the basement supporting the house. And of course, what you do in code is you ground out that steel. That's what you're supposed to do. But this amp had no ground reference. And by plugging the cord in backwards, it was actually had flipped it. So the strings, which are usually connected to the ground of the amp, were now hot. So the strings there's 120 volts wall potential difference between the strings of the guitar and the thing. And I moved around and hit it and like saw a spark and like blew a fuse. I'm like, all right, no, I need a different amp. I can't play with this guy's amp. And this is before I was really a super amp nerd, but it's like I knew something was wrong. This is dangerous.
They bite and you go, nah, no thanks.
Yeah.
So one of the questions is, this is from Defcon Clark. He says, let me put it up on screen. What's the benefit of 2 drive levels on the Cartographer?
Oh, okay, that's a great question. So, I'm kind of this is where the down and nerdy starts.
Yeah.
So,
my favorite amp, by the way.
Oh, awesome! Yeah, I kind of the story about the Cartographer is I got this blown up trainer. Someone had modded it. It wasn't really blown up, but someone had modded it and didn't sound very good. So, I essentially built my version of a hot rod JCM 800 2204 circuit in there, and then I would just discover some new circuit in an amp, and I just tried it out. It became my kind of test platform. And I used it in this loud and punk rock band I played in and still playing sometimes called Cartographer, which is how it got that name. And I use a very specific aluminum neck guitar. And so I kind of tuned the amp to work in that band with that weirdo guitar. And then I had it in the office and people really liked it. And I'm like, I can't believe people like this amp. It's so specific. So, the 2 drive knobs. Now, normally, and I'm gonna, I'll try to speak through this as clearly as possible.
No worries.
In the 2204 circuit, there is 3 gain stages, followed by this one stage called a cathode follower, and a tone stack. And the drive knob comes between gain stage 1 and gain stage 2. Now, in a plexi, there's only 2 gain stages in the tone stack, so there's 1 fewer gain stage. And the volume knob of a plexi comes between the first and second gain stage there. So you can kind of think of the 2204 circuit as being a plexi circuit where they put an extra gain stage in front and then move the drive knob before that. So they kind of moved everything back 1. So the second drive knob is kind of where the volume knob would be in a plexi amp. And by adjusting the ratios, like say if you have the gain 1 or drive 1 low and gain 2 high, it kind of sounds more like an overdriven classic plexi style distortion. And if you have the second drive kind of midway, or actually the second drive full up and you use drive 1, then it behaves like a JCM 800. So it just kind of can bring in these different textures, and by turning them both down and the master volume up, you can get actually a really good clean sound out of the amp. So it's by having 3 sounds, you can get a wide variety from like clean amp to kind of like really breathy classic rock distortion to kind of saturated like late 70s, early 80s hard rock.
So this could be the amp that you put as one amp and do snapshots to make it be 3 or 4 different sounding amps.
Exactly. That's what I do in my band Tiny Peloton. Is I just use a Cartographer, and then I have one button that when I hit it just toggles CCs of the parameters. So the master volume goes up to full and the 2 gain knobs go down pretty low. And I hit a button again, the master goes to about 4 or 5, and the 2 gains come up, and it becomes a 2-channel amp automatically just with by just cleverly adjusting the knobs.
Very, very, very nice. So a little bit, you mentioned something earlier when you talked about the knee. Can you explain knee? What is knee? Because I see that in some of the compressors. Is that the same thing?
Kind of. It's essentially how fast something transitions from an unaffected state to an affected state. So in amp distortion, like imagine if your volume is going up, you're putting in more signal, your volume is coming up, it's staying clean, and then suddenly it starts to distort. If it's a hard knee, it just rails. Like you hit a top limit and it just stops. It's just like, that's it. It's a very hard cutoff. That would be a very hard knee. Soft knees, as you start to get to the point of distortion, it kind of curves a little bit. It's like there's a, like a radius of a circle you start to see, and then it will finally get to the point where it just really saturates. And that transition period is kind of where the, the like mild breakup starts to happen.
The edge of breakup is a soft knee.
Yeah, like the Litigator amp. When I did that, I wanted to really have a lot of in-between sounds and characters. So I made a lot of the knees for all of the gain stages unrealistically soft. And so you have these cascading gain stages, but they're all kind of going into gain pretty soft. So you have a lot of range of tactile touch. And it's weird. People always say the amp is so dynamic, which I don't think is technically correct, because if it was really dynamic, you'd play louder and get louder. But what happens is you can play with dynamics and it stays at about the same volume, but just the amount of saturation changes. So you can just play hard and it's about the same volume, but just really dirty. And then as it kind of falls out, it stays about the same volume, but just cleans up and gets really nice. So that's kind of a way. Does that enough? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So, now, how much did you get involved? I mean, you do a lot of the amps. Do you get involved with the effects?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So you do all those. Tell me on the dynamic split. The new one. I tried to do a video and I think I covered it a little bit well, but explain the new dynamic split. Okay,
well, I believe Sam did most of the hard lifting for that. But the idea is that there's 2 signal paths in Helix. You have the A and the B, and you have a split. And the idea is that if you play over a certain level, it will go from using path A to using path B. And so that way you can have one effects chain that will be when you play quietly, and you'll have another effects chain for when you play loudly. So if you're really digging into the guitar, it'll start routing to the second effects chain. And then if you are playing quietly, it'll kind of fade itself back over to the effects chain on A. And I believe there are controls for how fast the transition happens, and there are controls for the threshold at what point the transition happens. So it's just kind of it's a little bit esoteric. It takes a certain kind of crazy mindset to use it. Probably not a traditional guitar player effect, but it's one of those things where it's like if you want to have a very, let's say, kind of morphing, changing guitar sound, you can have like, maybe a cleanish sound when you play quietly. It has like delays and modulations, and then maybe like some weird garbly pitch loud sound, so you can kind of switch in between, and it's almost like you're fading in between two signal paths based on the intensity of your playing level.
And I played with that because that was one that I was really looking forward to, more for adding that real dynamic, play softer, cleaner, accentuate that, the knee, accentuate that differences, but more drastic, more clean to more rough. But what I noticed, and I don't know whether I did something wrong, because I don't want to say it's a bug, but when I would slip into the path B, the chorus that I had on the upper, I could hear it in the lower. Now I didn't know whether that was because there was a sort of a almost called it like a 90-10 mix instead of going 100% hard.
Yeah, I don't know. To be perfectly frank, I have not used that effect a ton. I think I might have messed around with it once. I don't know if there's maybe an intensity control. There might be some control that prevents it from going fully to one side or the other. But yeah, I'd have to look into it. And yeah, if anyone else has used it and noticed anything, we'd love to hear. That's the thing is, it's kind of painful, but being told the mistakes as fast as possible is really the best way to make a really good product. So
are there still people who complain about the tuner?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Why?
I mean,
is there a reason why they might complain about the tuner? Why some people think it's, I mean, I know you can't answer for other people, but maybe you've heard what people have said. What is there's no problems with the tuner. I never had any problems with the tuner ever.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it just feels different. Like, before Helix, and, I guess we've been naming brands, and it's not, harsh, but I had a Boss pedal tuner for a long time. It worked great. And then I realized, I just kind of like the way this Korg tuner tunes a little bit better. It just seems to be able to help me get into tune faster when I'm on stage. And I started using that one, and it was no big deal. I didn't complain or go on any forums and say Boss tuner sucks. Like, they both worked fine. But, they did feel different for me. Like the way that I hit the string and the way that it zeroed in on the note, it worked differently. And, the Line 6 tuner does behave a little bit differently than other popular tuner brands. And it's not out of tune, but I think it's just maybe the amount, like the rate, the kind of, I don't want to say the time, but kind of the way it's like recognizes the pitch and kind of either helps you or hinders you to get it into tune. It's just it's a little bit different, and there's no real right or wrong. It's just what people like. But I think, we came from a world where Boss sold I don't know how many, but for a while it seemed like every band had 3 Boss tuner pedals on stage, and it kind of behaved a certain way. And I think people kind of got used to a couple certain brands of tuners. And if it doesn't react that way, then it's, then they just think it's crap, even if it's not. But, like for instance, I know Peterson tuners are great, and I've had 2 of the Strobo Stomps because I got them for good deals. And every time I thought I'd like it, and it just didn't work for me. It's just not my thing. I know it's a great tuner. I know it's super accurate. It has lots of functions, but it's just not my thing. It's cool.
Now, do you use the strobe tuner on the Helix?
No, I just use the regular tuner. I've always been fine. I have some weird tuning things because I've had problems with tuners a lot. So I have this weird thing where I tune almost exclusively using the 12th fret harmonic. Or I tune at an E note on every string. I'll hit the open E, 5th fret of the B string, 9th fret of the G string, 2nd fret of the D string, 7th fret of the A, and open E. I just get all the E's in tune. I do weird stuff like that. And I also do strange things like the G string and the low E change the most when you like if you turn the tuner like X amount, they will change the most in pitch on the G and the low E. So I know if I tune those first and then tune the rest of the strings, that'll pull the neck and those might be off again. So I always tune the low E and the G string last.
Yeah.
And it seems to make sure I end up in tune if I'm trying to tune fast on stage or something. It's just a lifetime of experiences all add up to an esoteric tuning procedure.
Yeah. Well, and if anybody is like me, their Les Paul, the G string is always problematic.
Yeah. Gibsons are like that. I feel like it's always weird to get a Les Paul or an SG and to like get that the A to sound right and the D. It's like always they're always a little bit off, but that's kind of the sound of the guitar.
That's rock
you just
and roll.
hit it. You just keep hitting it harder.
What's funny is you tune in the G on at least on every Les Paul I've done. You tune, and you're just right there, and you just tink. It's
pencil lead, dude.
Pencil lead. Yeah. Yes. That and graphite and all sorts of 90 weight motor oil and no, don't do that. So tell me, by the way, lots of people say they love the strobe tuner.
Cool.
And I've been using the strobe tuner, and I like it, but I also, I love this. It's the it's great. If you don't like something, if you don't like the Helix tuner, just get one on your neck. But yeah, some people they like the strobe tuner, and let's see, somebody else says usually start with the D and G and work his way outward. Everybody has their ways.
Yeah, that's the thing is you kind of discover it and then you see, you just start doing that, and it works for you and gets you tuned fast. I like that. I like how everyone gets to kind of make the world of guitar their own.
So on the new Fuzz, the Xenomorph, is that the Xenomorph?
Oh yeah, yeah. Okay.
Now was that one of yours that you did, or
that was what we call an inspired by pedal, and that usually comes when there's something we want to model, but it's so weird or bizarre, or we think of a way that we will actually want to do it rather than the pedal. But there was a pedal called the harmonic antagonizer, and it is really cool. And it is strange, and it's a lot of fun. And we were modeling it, and I was just like, it does so many weird things. We're never going to be able to hit the sound perfectly, but we can do the same kind of concept. So I just kind of recreated the idea, but made it with kind of my own fuzz voicing and my own thing. And for people who don't know, it's a fuzz pedal. So you can use it as just a normal fuzz pedal.
Yes.
But then there's also an oscillator built into it. And the oscillator, its pitch is totally unrelated to the note you're playing. But the pitch changes depending on how loud you're playing. So if you hit the strings really hard, it'll shoot up, and then it will kind of start to drop down in pitch as it gets quieter. But that pitch is not at all related to what the pitch of your guitar. So it just interacts and causes these weird intermodulation distortions, and the pitches kind of vibrate off one another and just form these new sounds. It is a crazy, crazy pedal. It's not for everyone, but if you want to make your guitar sound like a robot in a blender, it's yeah.
I ran into it the other day. Somebody asked about it. I was like, well, let me check it out. I checked it out on one of my live streams, and I was like, okay, this is cool, weird, cool and weird.
Yeah.
And I loved it. But then, I really do like, I wouldn't have called myself a fuzz player. I used to go for the Minotaur, but I have found myself gravitating for leads that seem to want to get through. The fuzzes, they seem to grab hold of you and if you're not going too crazy on it, they sound really, really good in the mix.
Well, the funny thing about it is, I don't know, fuzz pedals are obviously used by people who have crazy fuzz sounds, but like if you've ever gotten into like there's a whole website dedicated to just David Gilmour's guitar rig. And I kind of went down a rabbit hole one day and I checked out, and like all of his classic sounds in the 70s are like fuzz faces and big muffs, and he'll like be strung together, and then he'll use like an EQ, and he doesn't really ever use them for chords, but for like the kind of, there's so much like harmonic, let's just say harmonic craziness that happens around the notes that if you play single notes with a really gnarly fuzz, it just makes them sound bigger and wider in the frequency than they would be with just like kind of a regular distortion or overdrive pedal. But as soon as you started playing chords with that same sound, it would just turn into what most people would consider a big garbly mess. So it's kind of fun to be able to do that and realize that some you're digging into that world of like, oh hey, other people have discovered this too. If you you can get smooth, like classic, like dreamy sounds out of a fuzz when you throw a little delay on the end and only play one note at a time.
So a lot of people wonder, beginners, and I'm sure we have beginners that will watch this later. Order of pedals. What's your theory on order of pedals?
Okay. I've always kind of just been a traditionalist when it comes to that, which is, you have distortion, like a compressor first if you want it, distortion and overdrive, then modulations and delays and reverbs. I've mostly figured that out. But there's been a few times where I've been really surprised by a sound I liked that was wrong for most people's perspectives. And there was a friend's band. The band now is called Ariel, and he's been doing the same band for like 20 years, and they're really great. But when I first started playing shows with the guy and hanging out with him, he did a thing where the last pedal in his chain was an overdrive. So he was going through a whole pedal board of, delays and echoes and choruses, and then reverb, and then an overdrive. So the reverb trails were getting this wash of overdrive at all times. And it was a texture. It was like, this is just like the coolest sounding vacuum cleaner I've ever heard. It was amazing. And I'm like, oh, that's really awesome. Like, you're doing this really wrong, but it's a sound that no one else has because everyone else doesn't want to do it wrong. And I've seen a few other bands who've done things like that. Starting in the late 90s, I would always put an analog delay near the front of the signal chain. Because if I wanted like really clean delays, the digital delay layer in the chain would take care of that. But the first one would then run into my overdrive pedals, and I would get that kind of chewy, gnarly sound of the echoes kind of falling out of distortion as they're hitting the distortion pedal. So, the cop-out answer is to say there's really no right or wrong way, but the coolest thing is whether you're using Helix or if you're just using pedals, it's pretty easy to swap around and try some different things. And you can have a good time, messing around with stuff and figuring it out.
Well, that's kind of exactly why I asked the question, because there really, it's true. There really is no right or wrong. It's if you like it and it sounds good to you, then it is good.
Yeah.
But the classic 70s, a lot of the delays went into the front of the amp and dirty amp, and you get that. That's a certain sound that sometimes delays, and I love actually putting delays into the distortion for certain things.
Mm-hmm.
So
I mean, that's what everyone's used to hearing with like that Echoplex in the 70s and stuff. Is
right.
You couldn't put them anywhere else.
Right. Exactly. So with the reverbs, what's your favorite reverb that you have in Line 6?
I really been liking the Ganymede reverb, which is one that Sam did a couple updates ago, I think. And then I did one called the Plateau, where I just basically took the reverb engine from the Ganymede and added some pitch shifting in there as well. So it's like the octave reverb. Yeah. I really like that. It's not like a real acoustic space. It's a definite affected reverb. And, I grew up, listening to a lot of music from the 80s. So the kind of 80s rack reverb sound is really, it's super artificial, but it's kind of like what my ears like to hear the most. So I'm trying, I kind of try to recreate that with either the plate reverbs in Helix or with the Ganymede or Plateau.
So there's two kinds of people, and I believe I'm really accurate here.
Okay.
Those who love lots of reverb and those who lie and say they don't.
Oh man, it's but the thing is if you do use a lot of reverb, there's something about turning it off and how stark a guitar can sound. Like I have done that before. Like if a band is like, when I was a recording engineer, if a band really loved reverb, I'm like, okay, but in this one part of the song, let's just try using a totally dry guitar because it is going to stand out. And but yeah, I grew up playing Fender amps most of the time, and they always had reverb on them, and I just pretty much never turned it off. So
on the spring reverb, there's two kinds in the Helix. There's the 63 and just the spring reverb. What's the differences?
Well, the 63 is based on like the Fender tank, the external tube Fender tank reverb. So it's kind of voiced like that, which is pretty similar to the built-in reverb in Fender amps, but a little bit richer. And then the other one is like a studio spring or something like that. It's more of like the spring reverb that would be in a rack in a studio, and it's a little more controlled sounding, a little more kind of refined and safe, and kind of sits into a mix more and doesn't necessarily sound like a special effect so much as the 63 one does.
Nice. Let's see. I'm trying to go through my mind because there's always been little questions that I've had that I'm sure people have wanted to know, wanted to ask. So the deeper functions of the amps, where you get into the sag, the bias X, the hum, and the what's the other one? Ripple. Can you go through those?
Sure.
You probably have done this a million times, but
yes, so I'm pretty good at it.
Good.
So bias is the obvious one. In a Class AB amp, like you have two power tubes or four power tubes. Let's just say you have two. One is doing one side of the waveform, and then it comes down, and then the other one kind of picks it up and takes over the lower. And while that one is taking the lower part of the waveform, the first one is just turned off. And then it comes back up, and then they kind of hold hands, and then the lower one turns off, and the upper one goes again. And that's Class AB bias. So you're using each tube for half the swing. Now, in Class A amps, the tubes operate for the entire swing. And so you get a different distortion characteristic because you're kind of you're hearing distortions on both sides of the waveform. And when you're in Class AB, a lot of times you get more saturation. You might get what's called cutoff distortion, where sometimes you get a little nonlinearity when they cross over between the push side and the pull side. And so the bias knob, as you turn it up, as you turn it up, you get more hotter, more Class A. So you don't get the hand holding. You just basically get, they're kind of both being summed together, and we're each taking most of the voltage swing, and they're going to distort a little bit differently. And it's one of those things where, like, if it's in the center, that's how the amp actually sounds. And then you can kind of push it more Class AB or more Class A by turning the knob. I guess I'm doing that for me. So for you, it'd be this. Okay, so bias excursion. This is a weird one that's difficult to explain, but I'll do my best. Whenever you're distorting a tube and the tube is actually in the state of being distorted, you get a bunch of electrons that start to hang out around what's called the input grid. And that's where the signal goes into. It's called the input grid. Right before that is usually a capacitor, and the capacitor can hold a charge. Now, when the amp isn't distorting, there's no charge on the input grid. But when it starts to distort, a bunch of electrons hang out, and that creates a negative voltage that's on the grid, and it charges the capacitor. And then that starts to behave as if there was a negative DC voltage, essentially causing a bias shift in the tube, because it's not zero. It's not just a AC audio signal. It's an AC audio signal with a DC component. And it changes the characteristic of the distortion, but it only happens after the tube has been saturating for a certain amount of time. And then once it stops, it kind of drifts back to normal. So the more you turn that up, you'll kind of hear this artifact. And it's not something where you turn it and it's readily available. It's only when you turn it up and you're simultaneously saturating the power amp tubes like a good amount.
Fascinating.
But it's one of those things that happens in a lot of amps, and amp builders will change capacitor values and what's called a blocking, like a grid stopper resistor, to kind of voice the way the power amp sounds. If they want to be stiffer, if they want it to be more kind of interactive sounding. Let's see. So that's the bias excursion. So it's if you understood it, awesome. If you didn't understand the thing I said there, just mess with it and have fun. Hum is the fact that the tubes have to be heated, and that uses special AC heater windings, which are at 60 hertz in the United States. And that leaks into the sound just a little bit. And it was discovered that if you don't have that 60 cycle hum in there just a little bit when you're distorting a power tube, it doesn't quite sound right, because that tone messes around with the actual audio signal and causes just a little bit of, a musical distortion. And when you totally get rid of it, it starts to sound a little bit sterile. And that's what, so we always lit it in there, and we thought, oh, hey, we can put it on a knob. If people actually totally don't want it, they can just turn it down, get it out of there. And if they want more of it, or they want more of that crazy sound, they can turn it up. Ripple is similar, but it's only in the power amp. It's after the DC goes through the rectifier, or after the AC goes through the rectifier, it gets turned into pulsating DC, and then it gets smoothed out with these things called filter capacitors. But they're not perfect. And in some parts of the circuit, you can get the 60 cycle wall power that's been rectified. Now it's 120 hertz. That gets shoved into the power amp. So that brings that in a little bit. And that also affects tonality. And then, is that it? Was there another one? What am I forgetting? I feel like I'm forgetting one.
Ripple, hum, bias X.
Master. Master.
Master. Yeah, I think a lot. That's pretty easy for.
It's technically a deep edit parameter, but yeah, if the amp has a master volume on it, the master knob in Helix does exactly what that one does.
Sag.
If the amp we're modeling does, sag. Okay. Well, yeah, but I'll just finish the master.
Yeah.
If the amp doesn't have a master volume, we put one in the circuit where you would expect to see one if like an amp tech did a mod and put a master volume in for you.
Okay.
And turning it all the way up is like there's no master volume and it's just full bore loud amp. Sag, that happens in an amp. You hit a certain volume of playing and the power supply can't keep up with what the amp is being asked to do. And when that happens, all the tubes in it start to just compress and sag a little bit. So we have to make that happen to make the amp model sound right. And we realize, we can actually adjust it. So you can actually have less sag and have a stiffer amp, or you can have it be more saggy and have it really kind of start to compress and collapse on itself when you play loudly.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
So now this brings me to another set of questions that I've personally wondered.
Okay.
So you have, and it has to do with the placement of effects, but you have your amp, and then you have your preamp, in there in the explain. Okay, trying to get this out. Okay, so you have some people that say when you're going into the input of an amp on the back, the
power amp in,
that you shouldn't use any cabs because you're going through a cab, right?
Yeah.
So, but I've never liked that sound. I always felt it felt like it was missing, like the sound of of a speaker cab. So in other words, it just doesn't seem like, because I know I got a cab sitting there, it just never sounded right. So I've always put a cab in that. Am I doing something wrong, or is it just what I like? Or
I wouldn't say you're doing something wrong, but you are doing something unusual.
Okay.
Because generally, the cabinet has a very specific, sound. It has an EQ curve. It has a dynamic response, and that's what happens in the cabinets that we model. But the cabinet that you're playing through also has that as well. So you're kind of stacking the sound of a cabinet on a cabinet if you're running a cabinet and then going into a guitar-specific cabinet.
Right.
But it also depends on what kind of speaker cabinet you're using and what the speaker is in there. So, like, if you have what's your cabinet, for instance, if you're playing guitar that you're using?
It was the Fender, DeVille.
Okay.
410.
Yeah. So the 410 is probably going to have very wide, a good high frequency response and a pretty wide ranging thing. But it kind of has just one sound, and that's the sound of a 410 cabinet. And that's, a sound a lot of people like and use, and it fits in a band in a certain way. But if you're playing through like a Marshall amp or, let's see, I don't know, maybe something more lo-fi like a Supro or an Orange or something like that, like those aren't going to sound traditionally correct through that 410 speaker cabinet. So by putting your speaker cabinet of choice on top of that and then going into your 410, you're probably just it's kind of like an overall EQ to make it behave more like you're playing through that cabinet, like a 412,
got it,
a 112, some other kind of thing. So it's not like you're doing something wrong, but that's the thing, is if you don't use cabinet modeling, you're stuck with the one sound that the cabinet you're using has. And if you like it, awesome, go for it.
Right.
But if you want to have more tonal flexibility, putting in a cab is kind of like a quick way to get a complicated new EQ curve and response out of the amp.
So now, typically, if you put an amp and then you put a cab, some people put their effects before like in between the amp and the cab. Is that even necessary? Does that do anything?
In certain occasions it can do stuff, and that is when you're using effects that are, let's say pitch shifters and effects that have some kind of distortions built in. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, or I'm sure you have, Chad, but I don't know if all the users have noticed it. Some echo and modulation effects have what's called a headroom parameter.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that is because, I'm going to digress slightly here. The reason that is because when you're playing guitar through them, there's sometimes you can hit your guitar really hard and actually get a little bit of distortion out of them. And so we notice that a lot of times people boost the level of their signal up a lot in Helix when they're going through amp blocks. And they would then put, like there's the 70s chorus or like one of the tape delays after the amp, which is totally fine and natural. But by boosting their level up so much, they had started distorting the sound of the effect because it was really expecting a guitar level signal. So we added the headroom to get out of that. Now that distortion is going to add, anytime you add distortion, you add high frequency.
Yeah.
Because the distortion causes harmonics to go higher and higher up in the frequency. But the speaker cabinet simulators gets rid of a lot of that high frequency. And the same thing happens with pitch shift effects. If you're just doing distortion and then going into pitch shift, all the kind of high frequencies will then be pitch shifted up, especially if you're going upwards. And you will, if that is coming after your cabinet block, you will hear all those high frequencies because there's nothing else in the signal chain that will take it out. Like most cabinets roll off, we say around like 5 kilohertz or so, somewhere around there. And if you're playing a high note on guitar and it's distorting, creating harmonics, and then you're pitch shifting it up, or you're going into, something else that's distorting, and it's after a speaker cabinet, you start to hear all this high frequency information that a guitar speaker or traditional guitar cabinet would have gotten rid of long ago.
Right.
So if you want to do that, and you can try moving your cabinet block to the end and see, oh, do I like the way that sounds with the cabinet kind of being my final EQ, or do I like the cabinet earlier, and do I like the sound of the effects being my final EQ? So,
and if you're going to put it afterwards and you want to retain the stereo signal, you'd want to use a dual cab or 2 cabs.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay. So question that
Sure.
that brings me to the next thing is in the Power Cab Plus, because that comes at the absolute very end of what you're doing, and what you just talked about actually sort of clarifies it. That's kind of why I think it sounds so really, really good, because you are taking a lot of those highs out, like you just explained. So thank you for that.
Yeah. If you're using the speaker modeling and that, then it's going to come at the very end.
Right.
Yeah.
So very, very good. So one last couple questions, because I like to keep it to about an hour, and I think we're getting close.
Yeah.
What guitars do you have?
What guitars do I have? So let's see. My first guitar was a Telecaster. It's a made in Japan Telecaster, and I still have it, but I have done so much stuff to that. Like, it was always my experimental guitar. Probably had like 7 sets of pickups in it, a number of pick guards. I've gone through at least 3 switches, a couple output jacks, but it's like one of the guitars that I love to death. But that led me to getting a Baja Telecaster. And then I just recently picked up one of the Fender Ultra Telecasters, which I really, really like. I didn't think I was going to like it because I don't really tend to like modern-y hi-fi guitars, but I really dig it. Let's see. I was into offset guitars a lot in the 90s, and for a while I played a Jaguar as my main guitar, and then I have a Jazzmaster now that I kind of use in one band. But the guitar that I use for anytime I play heavy music is made by this company called the Electrical Guitar Company. And it is it's a standard guitar with like 2 single coil pickups, kind of a double cutaway shape. It has an all aluminum neck.
Oh, nice.
Aluminum neck and fretboard. And it goes all the way through the body. So the bridge and the pickups are all mounted into the same piece of aluminum that the neck is made out of. And it is this crazy, awesome, weird guitar. And I became friends with the guy who makes them. And it's like one of those things where it just, like, notes just jump out of the guitar. It's a ton of fun to play, and it's really weird and bizarre. And I've tried to use it in other bands, but I can kind of only use it when I'm playing like kind of like loud, aggressive music. It's just too much otherwise, I think.
I imagine it would sound pretty good in some clean instances too. Yeah,
it's I like to tell people it's like the guitar that you have to treat like subtractive synthesis. Like, it has a lot of low frequencies and it has a lot of just high frequencies. There's a lot of everything in between. And you kind of have to take away what you don't want. It's like people might say, oh, I like a Tele because it's bright, or I like a Les Paul because it's warmer. But really, it's like the Les Paul is just lacking the highs, and the Tele might be kind of lacking the lows and some of the sustain. This is has sustain, has highs, it has lows. It like harmonic can just jump right out because the frequency range goes so far. So it's kind of like half the time I have the tone knob rolled back a little bit on the guitar, and it's like I don't feel bad if I have to put a dramatic EQ on it to get a sound, because I kind of have to push the guitar into sounding like how I want it to.
Yeah. Well, and using the word subtractive brought me up to that of EQs. It's probably a good idea because people always tend to raise their EQs up. Is probably to exercise subtractive EQ. Take out the tones that you don't want, and because it is your take on a lot of people that they make their signal too loud on the Helix.
Generally, yeah. I mean, people should do whatever they want, but for me, I always level my amp so that if I turn it off, it's about the same level as if it wasn't on, So it's kind of almost like the amp sound is like an effect on its own.
Yeah, it doesn't raise. So when you turn it on and off of your amp, that level that you're hearing, there's no raise. Is what I'm taking from what you're saying. Yeah,
it might be a 2-3 dB raise, just a little bit sometimes. But like, if I play the loudest sound on the guitar, like if I'm just slamming into it and then I turn the amp model on, I expect it to be about the same level. That's just kind of how I like it. And it made leveling presets pretty easy for me. It's given me lots of room to play with on the big knob, because a lot of times I'm playing live and something sounds weird, I just kick the big knob slightly. I mean, I'm pretty caveman about it, but yeah, and I've never had a problem where it's like any sound is like overwhelmed in a recording or driven a recording channel too hard. I've had, and there's been a lot of times when I've been doing direct recording with the Helix through USB, and I'm like, oh, this actually has a lot of headroom, and I'll turn up the output block on the preset just to turn it up just for that, tracking that part. But when I'm playing live and switching between presets, I just kind of I play it pretty safe.
Well, we're at an hour, and I don't want to take too much of your time. I do thank you so much for
awesome
for coming on, and I think we could probably talk for hours and hours more.
Oh yeah,
and but this went by really, really fast, and so thank you very much. Stay on. I'll tell everybody goodbye, and then we'll say goodbye after we get offline. So
okie doke. Thanks a lot, man.
Hold on. And there you have it. That was Ben, and I really, really, really appreciate Ben being here. And I appreciate everybody commenting. There was so many things that I wanted to talk about with Ben, and I didn't get to talk your questions too much. But I sort of addressed the questions with a lot of my questions. So, but thank you all for being here. Thank you for liking, commenting, and sharing. And what was interesting is as Ben was talking, I saw 4 people thumbs this down, and it happened one after another. And I have a feeling I made an enemy or two. And well, I just want to say I'm really sorry if there's anybody who dislikes me, but I am who I am, and I am what I am, and that's all I gotta say. So hey, a thumbs down, that at least means you're paying attention at least long enough. So hey, we got counter thumbs up. That's great. So thank you guys for coming on, and we're gonna say goodbye. See you later. It's never goodbye. It's always see you later. See you later.